Maladrix, the Forsaken Queen, the Desperate Mother, the really freaky giant bug-like thing. Whatever you recognize her as, Maladrix is one of the most eye-catching new units released for Heroscape thus far. She's kind of an amalgamation of many different insectoids and arachnids, with a loving disposition of a xenomorph thrown in for good measure. A figure this powerful and eye-catching deserves an equally eye-catching color scheme. Remember, the only good bug is a painted bug. And with that, let's begin. I wanted a unique base for Maladrix, something both alien and insect-like, and honestly, color shift paints are a great method to bring a unique feel to the model. If you are uninitiated, color shift paints are paints that use pigments with small metallic flakes in them to allow for their hue to shift based on the angle they're viewed. These paints work best on flat, curved surfaces. And what do you know? Maladrix fits that bill exactly. This model was actually my first time using color shift paint, so let me impart some wisdom to save you the headaches I made along the way. You typically want a black undercoat for your model, as the black paint seemingly activates the color shift properties, allowing a stronger contrast to the prismatic effect to work. For the maximum sheen, definitely apply a glossy varnish to the black underlayer, as the shininess from the gloss will better catch the light and heighten the effect of the color shifts. When the paint is applied, it is initially very thin. You'll want to do several passes of the color shift paint, with each layer increasing the overall brightness of the paint beneath it. For this model, I did about 4 layers, which leads to the next point. A hairbrush is your friend for these kind of paints. You'll both save a lot of time and have a much smoother finish. You'll most likely want to use some acrylic thinner as to not clog up your airbrush, and that shouldn't reduce the vibrancy by using said thinner. Of course, I realize not everyone has an airbrush. However, you can still use a standard brush to apply the color shift paints to your model. I definitely recommend using a large bodied brush to limit the texture and strokes on the model. And make sure it's not your best brush, as the small flakes in the paint can definitely cause havoc to your brush bristles over time. There are many different brands and colors of color shift paints to use. I found Dork to have a nice, smooth, and solid coverage, so I used their cold open color as I like the colors and the effect of it. Now with that Dork applied and fully dried, I broke out the brushes and started working on the body of Maladrix. Maladrix has lots of surface area and is quite hard to hold while painting. I definitely recommend painting the queen in segments as to avoid rubbing off the applied paint or kind of damaging progress already made. Since Mally has so many individual segments, I definitely recommend having a plan when you start to paint her, as you may accidentally paint one part of the model but forget to mirror it on the opposite side. And I know I certainly had this problem and had to go back and fix some steps while I painted Maladrix. I still wanted the Dork to be the star of the model, and decided to limit the dark brown to the segmented legs and small bits on the body. When painting the legs, be aware of where your brush is going and where the armor plating begins and ends. I had a tendency to overbrush and get the paint onto non-desired areas, so definitely take a little bit more caution to save you some headaches later on. I'll probably say this a few times throughout this tutorial, but Maladrix has a lot of angles, curves, and easily missable areas. Definitely make sure you spin the model around to find any missing areas for that complete and total coverage. Overall, you want to focus on the parts that are more prominent and will be seen actually when it's on the playing field, as there are some really hard to get areas underneath the model with all those legs and that undercarriage. Try to use your time wisely. Don't focus too much on the underside if you're not even, giving the love to the top where people are actually going to notice all your hard work. When you use Dorks, you typically want diametrically opposed colors, so that the shifting colors don't look too similar to your standard, layered colors that you're using. I use some dark yellow green, which is one of my favorite colors from Pro Acryl, for the various chitin bits on the legs, the claws, and the center chest piece. Pro Acryl paints are tricky. They're very strong and have great coverage, but they do appear a lot more darker when initially applied. As they dry, they lighten up, and you'll have to go through with a couple layers just to ensure maximum coverage. They're also very matte, and you may be looking for more for a glossy or semi-gloss look, and these paints don't necessarily provide that full experience, so it may be worthwhile to look into other paints, or as we'll explore in later steps, there's other ways to bring out that gloss. The top head was lacking a bit of contrast as well, so I picked out some of the horn aspects, tips of the horn to have the green fill consistent with the rest of the model. I did about 2 coats of this to ensure that, those areas were fully covered, and then just went on to the next step. Again, for these parts, I'm using a rather large size brush as well, just to really not waste my time. This is a big model, and, a bigger brush will cover more surface area, as this kind of makes sense, but sometimes I find newer painters struggle to understand that you can have good control with a good sized brush. I wanted to add some depth and darken the green parts of the model without making it too muddy, so I kind of decided to blend and downshift the green applied with some green shade. I typically don't use many Citadel products, but the green wash I had on hand fit the bill and filled in the cracks of the legs rather well, and also kind of blended a bit of the color without making it too dark and muddy. I used a heavy body brush and gently applied it to the selected spots. These legs have some very unique texture on them, and you want to definitely make sure that the wash doesn't kind of pull in the various sharp curves and ridges. And definitely be sure to rotate the model around, as you don't want to miss any spots and kind of have it appear irregular compared to the rest of the model. I definitely suggest letting the whole wash completely dry before you handle it, as Maladrix has limited holdability, and you can definitely remove both paint and wash if you handle it while wet. You definitely want this wash to be a bit heavier, more towards the center of the model, kind of where these bespoke leg spikes arise, kind of around the center of the leg, as that's where the most shadows would realistically fall. And also take care not to have the wash flow into other parts of your finished model, like the brown parts or the turbo Dork. And so Maladrix was looking a bit flat, so I decided to add a bit of definition via highlights. I mixed some black, brown, and yellow ochre, both from Pro Acryl, together to really start to add some definition to Maladrix's more darker body parts. I used a rough sketching motion and kept the paints relatively thin, and started kind of outlining the outermost shapes that would realistically reflect the light. For the areas that caught the most light, I used a little bit more yellow ochre in the mix and started bringing up those details even brighter. I used edge highlighting, especially for the cowl of the model, just to kind of define those lines and shapes and really make that stand out, as that's the part that will be most viewed on the model. I used also a bit of stippling just to kind of add some texture to more of the smoother areas and create a softer blend. For the little leg spikes, I also just tried to kind of catch the outermost curve, realistically where the light would most reflect, and just kind of worked on this back and forth a bit, adding some highlights and definition. Highlights are a great thing to work on, and honestly, it's a video on of itself, but I thought I'd give a brief overview of what I did here. And next, I took a fine tip brush and some light yellow-green and started bringing up the respective highlights of the green area. You, of course, can do more of a dry brush motion for this part, as honestly, it catches the surface of the legs really well, but I chose to layer in some brighter colors instead. The paint I'm using is pretty thin, thin to the point where it flows easily off the brush, as I don't want it to be watery and filling in the gaps with paint and the shade in it. One thing to realize is that there's a lot of legs on this model, and anything you do on one leg, you'll definitely need to be done to the rest of the legs many times over. As mentioned before, I was kind of rushing to get Mal done for that tournament, so I kind of was just doing more kind of a sketching, just kind of trying to create distinctions of point and separation on the legs, but not worrying too much about blending and making it look super smooth. I wasn't trying to kind of define, the total highlights, but rather just give a bit of volume and dimension to the legs. I really focused mainly on the center area and the outermost parts, kind of trying to do a bit of edge lighting and center highlighting using layering. If you may notice, I kind of was rushing and kind of in the zone, and then fully realized I was overfilling my brush, getting that paint all the way to the bottom of it, the part called the ferrule, where the hairs connect with the kind of the connecting piece of the brush. You definitely want to avoid this, as it'll make your good brushes decidedly not so. If you do catch yourself doing this, make sure you use brush soap and rinse out the brush quickly when that happens, to try to save your brush from damage. Now, I wanted to blend and kind of darken the feel of Maladrix's body, so I applied a wash to those respective parts. Every wash acts very similar, but Army Painter tones are definitely a bit thicker than their comparatives. I typically use Army Painter washes as color filters, kind of going ahead of time, adding the highlights a bit brighter, and not worrying too much about the blending between these two colors, as the shade will definitely darken and make those two colors appear a bit more smooth. I find it better to increase the brightness to a higher level than you typically like on the final model, and then apply it, as the wash definitely darkens the appearance of where it was put on the model. Again, using that heavy brush, I cover all the selected areas, allowing for the pigment to soften the transitions from the highlights and the base layer. Normally I like the matte nature of the Pro Acryl underneath, but it just felt a little bit too flat for something so bug-like. The wash has a bit more gloss to it, so I bumped up the painted spots to a more desirable sheen I was looking for. I also applied a bit of black wash to the Turbo Dork areas, just to deepen the shadows a bit. Wash isn't needed for Turbo Dork paint, but I just wanted to test out to see if I could tone down the brightness and fill in some of these respective gaps on the model. I thinned down some Pro Acryl black wash to a point where it was very easily flowed and mainly settled in the recesses, and applied it to the Turbo Dork painted areas of the model. After that dried, I went through and did another brush layer of Turbo Dork on top of the wash, mainly avoiding the recesses to maintain a bit of that transition effect of the color shifts, as well as maintaining the darkness that settled in the recesses. So time for the itty-bitty details. Maladrix has a maw full of tiny needle-like teeth. And for that, I decided to use an appropriately needle-sized brush. A brush with a very thin head, and using a dark ivory color, I'm just starting to pick out the various lines using small, thin strokes. Ideally, you want that separation between each tooth to make the teeth more prominent, but if you do find it easier just to paint that whole area and add a wash, you can do that as well. You want to be patient and treat each tooth kind of as its own individual thing, using that long, thin line to get that full coverage. And don't be too particular about it, as it's a very small area, not a lot of detail to work with. Once that dries, you want to go through and add a brighter, neutral. I use that ivory mixed with a bit of white just to kind of catch a bit of the light and add some structure to it. Have just a blob of white in that area. You can take that thin brush once it's all done. You can take that thin brush and that dark brown and just try to fill in some of the gaps manually instead of using a wash, as it'll be a bit cleaner, but it does require a bit more hand and brush control. And for the eyes, I took that light ivory I was using and I put a small dot in each of those tiny eye holes. After that dried, I used some fluorescent green paint and thinly applied that over to create this very bright, glowing eye look I wanted for the model. I plan on talking more about fluorescence in the future, so stay tuned for some more info on that. And we're essentially finished at this point. I went through and added some other brown to the basing, as well as some additional cool base effects, and used some satin varnish to seal in the colors and add a bit more sheen to the overall look of the model, and some final touch-ups and highlights here and there. Hopefully this video gives you an idea on how to treat your Maladrix differently if you're painting it, add some really cool color effects, and maybe try some different paints that you've never used before. Feel free to experiment with your schemes, as there's lots of different color shifts out there to apply to your terrifying queen and her respective bug army. Remember, to paint the bug, you gotta understand the bug. Do you want to learn more?